The snow had turned to slush hours ago, mixing with the filth of downtown Detroit into a gray paste that clung to everything it touched. Julian Corsi stepped out through the kitchen exit of Bellini's, a restaurant whose wine list cost more than most families in the city earned in a month. The negotiations inside had gone well. A port deal with the Colombians, $60 million in uncut product moving through Windsor by February. Clean. Quiet. The way Julian preferred it. His bodyguard, Nico, a barrel-chested Serbian who had been with Julian since the early days in the Corktown warehouses, held the back door open and scanned the alley with practiced efficiency. Two more men, Reeves and Tomas, flanked the armored black Escalade idling at the curb, its exhaust plume rising in the frozen air like a slow ghost. "Car's warm, boss," Nico said. Julian adjusted his cashmere overcoat and started toward the vehicle. He was thinking about the Colombians. Specifically, about the way their lead negotiator's left eye had twitched when Julian mentioned the loading docks at Rouge River. A lie somewhere in the chain. He'd deal with it tomorrow. He was 3 steps from the Escalade when a shape detached itself from the darkness. It happened fast. A thin figure, small, barely clearing Julian's waist, lunged from behind the dumpster and planted itself directly between Julian and the open car door. The bodyguards reacted before Julian's brain fully registered the movement. 3 hands reached for 3 concealed weapons. Nico's Glock cleared its holster in under a second, the muzzle tracking downward toward the shape. A boy. 10, maybe 11 years old. Filthy in the way only the truly homeless get filthy, not the careless dirt of a child who played outside too long, but the ground-in grime of someone who had slept on concrete for months. His jacket was 3 sizes too large, duct-taped at one elbow. His sneakers had no laces. His breath came in ragged clouds, and his lips were cracked and bluish from the cold. But his eyes were steady. That was the detail Julian noticed first, the detail that made him pause instead of waving Nico forward. The boy's eyes were not wild with desperation or glazed with drugs. They were sharp, focused, and aimed directly at Julian's face with an intensity that didn't belong to a child. "Don't get in the car," the boy said. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but each word was delivered with a clarity that cut through the winter air like a blade. "There's a bomb." 3 seconds. That's all it took. In the first second, Julian's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. His brain, hardwired after 23 years in organized crime to categorize every human interaction as either a threat, an opportunity, or an irrelevance, slotted this into the third category, a street hustle. Kid says something dramatic, you flinch, he asks for $20. Detroit's gutters produced a dozen of these every winter night. Julian lifted his chin toward Nico, a gesture that meant remove the obstacle. In the second, the boy opened his left hand. His palm was black with grime, the nails cracked and edged with what looked like coal dust. Sitting in the center of his small, dirty hand was a device no larger than a cigarette lighter. Matte black. A single recessed button on its face, protected by a flip guard. Julian had seen enough detonators in his career to recognize this one immediately. It was a manual RF trigger, the kind used by demolition crews and, more relevantly, by people who wanted to turn a vehicle into a coffin from a safe distance. No Hollywood countdown. No blinking lights, just a quiet little box that could end a life with a single press. In the third second, the boy jerked his chin toward the far corner of the street. Julian's gaze followed the gesture and locked onto a figure standing near the mouth of the intersecting alley. Raymond Gage. Julian's driver for the past 6 weeks, a replacement sent up through channels after the previous man retired to Florida. Gage was supposed to be sitting behind the wheel with the engine running. Instead, he stood 40 feet away, his face drained of color, one hand fumbling frantically inside his coat pocket, searching for something that wasn't there anymore. Gage saw Julian looking at him. For a frozen beat, their eyes met across the distance. Then Gage turned and ran, his shoes skidding on the icy sidewalk, his coat flapping behind him. As he swung his arm for balance, the sleeve rode up, exposing his right hand. Even at that distance, even in the orange wash of the streetlight, Julian saw it. A black crucifix tattoo, faded and amateur, inked across the knuckles. The tattoo of Victor Carbone's people. Nico started to pursue, but Julian's voice stopped him. Let him run. The words came out flat, controlled, but Julian's mind was detonating faster than any bomb. Two truths crystallized simultaneously, each one worse than the last. The first, a homeless child, an 11-year-old ghost surviving on scraps in downtown Detroit, had pickpocketed a professional assassin. He had lifted a detonator from a trained killer's coat while standing close enough to breathe on him, and not a single member of Julian's elite security detail had noticed. The boy hadn't stumbled onto the plot by accident. He had seen something, sensed something, and acted on instinct so refined it bordered on preternatural. The second truth was the one that made Julian's blood cool by several degrees. The man who wanted him dead was not a rival boss, not the Colombians hedging their bets, not a federal task force making a move. The man who had planted a bomb under Julian's armored car was Victor Carbone, Julian's half-brother, his second in command. The man who controlled the Eastern Territories, who managed the enforcers, who sat at Julian's right hand at every strategy meeting for the past 15 years. The Empire had been betrayed from within. "Nico," Julian said, his voice still terrifyingly calm. "We're not taking the Escalade. Get the backup vehicle from the garage on Cass. Now." Nico didn't ask questions. He never did. He pulled out his phone, made a call, and within 4 minutes, a nondescript gray sedan pulled up 2 blocks away. Before the car arrived, Julian did something his bodyguards had never seen him do in 2 decades of service. He grabbed the boy by the collar of his oversized jacket, not roughly, but with the firm grip of a man seizing a lifeline he hadn't expected, and pulled him toward the approaching sedan. "Hey," the boy protested, his sharp eyes suddenly wide. "Let go of me. I told you about the bomb. We're square." "Get in the car," Julian said. It was not a request. The sedan pulled away from the curb, headlights cutting through the swirling snow. Julian sat in the back with the boy, Nico riding shotgun, his weapon resting on his thigh. The streets of Detroit scrolled past the tinted windows, a landscape of boarded storefronts and vacant lots that Julian had spent his life monetizing. "What's your name?" Julian asked without looking at the boy. "Leo." "Leo what?" "Just Leo." Julian turned to face him for the first time in the confined space of the car. Up close, the boy looked worse than he had under the streetlight. His cheekbones were too prominent, the hollows beneath them too deep. A scar, thin and white, traced a line from his left ear to the corner of his jaw. His hands, now empty of the detonator, fidgeted constantly, fingers rubbing against each other in a self-soothing rhythm that Julian recognized. He'd seen it in men fresh out of solitary confinement. "How did you know about the bomb?" Julian asked. "I didn't know about the bomb," Leo said. "I knew about the guy." "Explain." Leo's eyes darted to Nico in the front seat, then back to Julian. Trust was clearly not something he distributed freely. "I sleep near that restaurant sometimes," he said. "Behind the ventilation unit on the south wall. Warm air comes out, smells like garlic bread." He paused, as if the memory of warm air was worth savoring. "I've seen your car come and go for a while. Same driver every time. Tonight the driver was different." "We changed drivers 6 weeks ago," Nico interjected from the front. Leo shook his head. "The car was the same, but this guy, the new one, he was wrong." "Wrong how?" Julian pressed. "The way he walked." Leo's brow furrowed as he searched for words to describe what was clearly an instinct rather than an analysis. "When your old driver waited for you, he'd lean against the car, eat smoke, check his phone. Relaxed. This guy tonight, he was stiff. His shoulders were up around his ears, and when he got close to the car, his hands smelled like chemicals. Not gasoline, something sharper, like bleach mixed with something else." Julian stared at the boy. "You could smell his hands?" "I was close. I asked him for spare change. That's when I lifted the thing from his pocket." Leo said this with no pride and no shame, the way a carpenter might mention using a hammer. "I didn't know what it was at first. Then I saw him go under the car earlier tonight before you came out. He had a bag. He was under there for maybe 2 minutes. After that, I figured it out." The car fell silent, except for the hum of tires on wet asphalt. Julian studied the boy the way he studied contracts, looking for the clause that would unravel the deal. But there was no clause. There was only a child with the survival instincts of something that had lived too long in the wrong ecosystem. Hypervigilance, the psychologists called it, the chronic state of heightened alertness that developed in children exposed to sustained threat. It was a disorder when written in medical textbooks. On the streets of Detroit, it was the only thing keeping kids like Leo alive. "Mr. Corsi," Nico said from the front, his voice carefully neutral. "If Gage belongs to Victor, then Victor knows the bomb didn't go off. He'll assume you're alive. He'll move fast." Julian understood the implications without them being spelled out. Victor controlled the enforcers, the communication network, the loyalty of at least half the organization. By morning, Victor would have spun a narrative. Julian was killed by a rival faction. Victor was stepping up to avenge his beloved brother and restore order. Anyone who questioned the story would be quietly eliminated. Julian's phones were compromised. His safe houses were known. His accounts could be frozen the moment Victor's tech people flagged activity. Julian Corsi, the man they called the Architect for his ability to construct untraceable empires, was now a fugitive in his own kingdom. "Where are we going?" Leo asked, pulling his oversized jacket tighter around himself. Julian looked at the boy. Then he looked at the city scrolling past the window, at the dark maze of abandoned factories and condemned buildings that sprawled across Detroit's east side like a concrete cancer. A maze that Julian's organization had never fully mapped because it had never needed to. The people who lived in those ruins, the homeless, the addicts, the forgotten, were invisible to men like Julian. They didn't factor into territorial calculations. They didn't appear on any ledger. But they knew every tunnel, every passage, every gap in every fence. Leo knew. "I need to disappear for 48 hours, Julian said, turning to the boy. "I need someone who knows the parts of this city that don't exist on any map. The abandoned rail yards, the factory basements, the service tunnels under the old streetcar system." Leo's expression shifted. The wariness deepened. "Why would I help you?" "Because I'll pay you enough to leave Detroit permanently. New city, clean start." Leo laughed. It was a short, ugly sound, nothing like a child's laugh should be. "Mister, I've been promised clean starts by social workers, cops, and 2 different foster families. You know what a clean start looks like for a kid like me? A different city's sidewalk." "This would be different?" "Sure it would." Leo looked out the window. His reflection stared back at him from the glass, small and spectral. "Fine. 48 hours. But I'm not carrying a gun. I'm not hurting anybody. And when it's done, you forget you ever saw me." The unlikely alliance between a crime lord and a child was sealed not with a handshake, but with mutual desperation. Julian needed Leo's knowledge of the city's underworld, and Leo, whether he admitted it or not, needed the illusion that someone in this frozen city actually required his existence for something. They abandoned the sedan near Michigan Central Station, the massive Beaux-Arts ruin that loomed over Corktown like a cathedral to a dead god. From there, Leo led Julian and Nico through a hole in a chain-link fence, down an embankment slick with ice, and into the service entrance of an old maintenance tunnel that ran beneath the rail yards. The tunnel was pitch black, the air thick with the smell of rust and standing water. Leo moved through it with the confidence of someone navigating their own living room. Julian followed, his Italian leather shoes sliding on the wet concrete, his overcoat catching on exposed rebar. The contrast was absurd, and neither of them mentioned it. They emerged into a basement beneath what had once been a tire factory on the east side. Leo had clearly used this space before. A pile of cardboard and old blankets occupied one corner. A coffee can filled with matches sat on an overturned milk crate. With practiced efficiency, Leo built a small fire in a metal barrel, the flames casting dancing shadows across the graffitied walls. "Welcome to the Ritz," Leo said. Julian lowered himself onto a concrete block near the fire, his body protesting the cold and the exertion. Nico took up position near the entrance, a sentinel in a ruined kingdom. In the flickering light, Julian studied the boy more carefully. He noticed things he'd missed in the car. The scars on Leo's wrists, thin and parallel, too deliberate to be accidental. The way Leo automatically positioned himself in the corner farthest from the entrance but closest to a second exit, a boarded window that could be kicked out in seconds. The way his eyes never stopped moving, scanning, cataloging, assessing. "How long have you been on the streets?" Julian asked. 2 years, give or take." "Where were your parents?" Leo's jaw tightened. The fire popped. "Dead." "How?" "Fire. The single word hung in the air between them, dense with things unsaid. Julian recognized the tone. It was the same tone he used when people asked about his own father, a longshoreman who drank himself into a grave before Julian turned 15. Flat. Final. The door slammed shut. Julian didn't push further. Not yet. Over the next 36 hours, they moved through Detroit's invisible geography like ghosts. Leo proved to be more valuable than Julian had imagined. The boy knew which abandoned buildings had working plumbing from illegally tapped water lines. He knew which alleys were monitored by traffic cameras and which ones weren't. He knew that the homeless man named Charlie who camped under the I-75 overpass had a police scanner, and that for a pack of cigarettes, Charlie would share what frequencies Victor's people were using to coordinate the search. Julian used this intelligence with surgical precision. With Leo scouting ahead, his small frame and ragged appearance rendering him invisible to Victor's soldiers, who were looking for a well-dressed crime lord, not a street kid, Julian accessed 3 of his emergency caches: cash, weapons, and encrypted communication devices stashed in locations known only to himself and Nico. He dismantled 2 of Victor's communication relays, cutting off his half-brother's ability to coordinate the Eastern teams. He eliminated 3 lookouts guarding one of Victor's money laundering fronts, a laundromat on Gratiot Avenue, and burned the records inside. Each strike was quiet, professional, and devastating. The architect was building something new, the blueprint for his brother's destruction. There was one moment during the raid on the laundromat that neither of them spoke about afterward, but neither forgot. Leo had been positioned across the street, watching the front entrance from behind a bus shelter, counting the guards as they rotated shifts. He was supposed to signal Julian when the gap opened. 2 minutes between the departing guard and the arriving replacement, a window Julian needed to enter through the service alley. But a patrol car had crawled down Gratiot just as the gap was opening. Not Victor's people. Actual police, 2 officers on a routine sweep. They slowed when they passed the bus shelter. One of them rolled down the window. "Hey kid, you got somewhere to be?" Leo didn't hesitate. He launched into a story about his aunt's apartment being 3 blocks over, how she'd sent him to the corner store for milk, how the store was closed, and now he was waiting for his cousin to pick him up. The lies came out smooth, rehearsed, delivered with a practiced tremor of childish uncertainty that made the officers nod sympathetically and drive on. Julian, watching from the alley mouth, felt something tighten in his chest. Not admiration exactly. Something closer to sorrow. The boy was 11 years old, and he lied to authority figures with the fluency of a seasoned operative. Not because he was a criminal, because the world had taught him, through a curriculum of neglect and violence, that honesty was a luxury the vulnerable couldn't afford. On the morning of the second day, as they moved through the basement corridors of an old automobile parts warehouse, Leo stopped abruptly. Julian nearly collided with him. "What?" Julian whispered, "Listen." Julian listened. He heard nothing. The silence of concrete and dust. "Exactly," Leo said. "No pigeons. There were pigeons nesting in the rafters last week. Something scared them off, recently. They changed routes, circling 3 blocks north before doubling back." 40 minutes later, from a rooftop 2 buildings over, Julian spotted what Leo's ears had detected. 2 of Victor's men positioned in the warehouse's upper windows, rifles resting on sandbag mounts, covering the exact corridor they would have walked through. Julian looked at the boy, who was crouched beside him on the rooftop, chin resting on his folded arms, watching the snipers with the detached curiosity of a naturalist observing predators. "How did you know?" Julian asked. "The pigeons." "Everything tells you something," Leo said, without looking away from the windows. "You just have to care enough to listen." It was, Julian realized, the most concise summary of intelligence work he had ever heard, delivered by someone who had never read a manual on the subject. But it was during the quiet hours, in the basements and tunnels between operations, that something unexpected happened. Something Julian, in his decades of calculated cruelty, was entirely unprepared for. In the basements and tunnels between operations, that something unexpected happened. Something Julian, in his decades of calculated cruelty, was entirely unprepared for. It started with small things. Sharing food. Julian had never in his adult life eaten cold canned beans with a plastic spoon, and the experience was as humbling as it was unpleasant. But he noticed that Leo, who had clearly gone hungry many times, automatically divided every portion exactly in half without being asked. When Julian tried to give the boy a larger share, Leo shook his head. Even split, that's the rule. Whose rule? Julian asked. My mom's, Leo said. Then he shoved a spoonful of beans into his mouth and stared at the fire. Conversation over. Later, during a freezing wait in an old coal bunker while Victor's patrol passed overhead, Julian found himself teaching the boy things. Not criminal skills, though some of those inevitably seeped through, but smaller, stranger lessons. How to control your breathing so your exhaled vapor wouldn't give away your position. How to walk on broken glass without making sound. How to read a person's intention by watching their hands instead of their eyes. Eyes lie, Julian told him. Hands tell the truth. If someone's going to hurt you, their hands will move before their eyes change. Leo absorbed everything with the focused intensity of a creature that understood. At a cellular level, that knowledge was the difference between surviving the night and not. And Julian, without consciously deciding to, began to notice things that bothered him. The way Leo flinched when Julian raised his voice. The way the boy slept in 15-minute intervals, never deeper, his body trained to wake at any sound. The raw, chapped skin on his hands split open at the knuckles from cold. During one rest period, Julian removed his overcoat, the $12,000 Loro Piana cashmere that had been his armor in 100 boardroom wars, and draped it over the boy's shivering shoulders without a word. Leo looked up at him with an expression Julian couldn't decode. Surprise, maybe, or confusion. As though kindness were a foreign language he'd once known but had forgotten. You're a weird gangster, Leo said. And you're a weird kid, Julian replied. It might have been the closest either of them had come to affection in years. On the second night, they sheltered in the basement of an old coal processing plant on the riverfront. The space was vast and dark. The walls blackened with decades of soot. Leo had fallen asleep near the fire, exhaustion finally overpowering the hypervigilance that kept him wired throughout the day. In sleep, the hard lines of his face softened, and Julian could see, for the first time, the child beneath the survival mechanism. Small, thin, defenseless. As the boy shifted in his sleep, something fell from the torn lining of his jacket with a soft metallic clink against the concrete floor. Julian reached down and picked it up. It was a locket. Silver, partially blackened by fire damage, the chain broken and knotted back together with wire. Julian turned it over in the firelight. On the front, scratched but legible, were the initials AM. He pried it open with his thumbnail. Inside was a photograph, faded and heat-warped, but still recognizable. A young couple, mid-20s, the woman with dark curly hair and a wide smile, the man thin-faced with gentle eyes. Between them, held aloft on the man's shoulders, a small boy with a gap-toothed grin. Leo, before the streets had carved the softness from his face. A family portrait from a life that no longer existed. Julian almost closed the locket, almost set it down and moved on. But something made him turn it over one more time, and when he did, the firelight caught the engraving on the back. A crow holding a coin in its beak. Julian's hand stopped moving, his breathing stopped. For a long moment, the only sound in the coal basement was the crackle of the fire and the distant groan of wind through the ruined building above. He knew that symbol. He had designed it himself. The crow and coin was the mark of the Corsi organization, not the kind of mark that appeared on business cards or letterhead. It was the mark that appeared on the silver pendants distributed to the families of collateral damage. Julian's term, not the legal system's. 2 years ago, Victor had led a team to torch a tenement building on Detroit's east side. The target had been a small-time dealer named Watts who owed money and had been selling on Corsi territory without permission. The fire was supposed to be contained to the ground floor unit. It wasn't. The blaze spread through the building's antiquated ventilation system in minutes. 14 apartments, 39 residents, 7 dead, including a young couple on the 4th floor named Marcos and Anna, whose bodies were found in the hallway outside their apartment. They had been trying to reach their son's bedroom when the ceiling collapsed. Their son, age 9 at the time, had been pulled from a fire escape by a neighbor and handed off to paramedics. He disappeared from the hospital 3 days later, before child services could process him. Julian's people had distributed the pendants to the survivors and the families of the dead, along with modest cash payments and an implicit threat. The crow means silence. You accept the money, you wear the pendant, and you never speak of this to police or anyone else. The survivors complied. They always did. The story never made it past the local news, buried under 100 other tragedies in a city that had been drowning for decades. Julian stared at the locket in his hand. The fire painted his face in orange and shadow. He looked at the sleeping boy whose parents he had killed, whose life he had destroyed, who had somehow, through the cruel mathematics of fate, ended up saving the life of the very man responsible for every nightmare that haunted his sleep. He did not close the locket. He sat with it open in his palm for a very long time, and something inside him, something he had sealed shut decades ago, cracked along a fault line he didn't know existed. When Leo woke an hour later, Julian was sitting in exactly the same position, the locket resting on the concrete between them. Leo's eyes found it immediately. His body went rigid. "Where did you get that?" Leo's voice was barely audible. "It fell from your jacket." Leo snatched it up and clutched it to his chest, a reflex so primal it predated language. "Don't touch it. It was my mom's." "I know," Julian said. Something in his tone made Leo look at him, really look at him, with those eyes that missed nothing. "What do you mean you know?" Julian didn't answer the question. Instead, he asked one. "The fire. The one that killed your parents. Do you know who started it?" Leo's expression didn't change, but his breathing did. It became shallow, controlled, the breathing of a small animal that has just detected a predator. "Some gang," he said carefully. "They never caught anyone. The cops didn't even try. It was just another fire in East Detroit." "It wasn't just another fire," Julian said. The silence between them was no longer the companionable quiet of two people sharing warmth by a fire. It was the silence of a wire pulled taut, one vibration away from snapping. "The symbol on the back of that locket," Julian said. His voice was steady, but his hands, the hands he'd taught Leo to watch, were not. "Do you know what it means?" "It means shut up and don't talk to anyone," Leo said. "Some men came to the hospital after, gave me the necklace and some money, told me if I ever told anyone what happened, they'd come back." Julian nodded slowly. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a ring, gold, heavy, custom-made. On its face, cast in relief, a crow holding a coin. He set it on the concrete between them, the same way he'd set down the locket. Then he waited. Leo's eyes moved from the ring to Julian's face and back again. The recognition was not instant. It built like a wave, starting somewhere deep and rolling forward through layers of denial and disbelief until it broke across his features with devastating force. His mouth opened. No sound came out. His small body began to tremble, not from cold this time, but from something far worse. "No," Leo whispered. The word was almost a plea. "No, you're not." "The order came from me," Julian said. "The fire was set on my command. Your parents died because of a decision I made from behind a desk in a building 50 miles from where they slept." The coal basement became a courtroom. Julian sat perfectly still, offering no defense, no mitigation, no excuse. He watched the boy's face cycle through emotions that no 11-year-old should know how to feel. Confusion, denial, comprehension, horror, and finally, a hatred so pure and absolute that it seemed to age him 10 years in 10 seconds. Leo scrambled backward, his sneakers scraping on the sooty concrete. His back hit the wall. His breathing came in short, ragged bursts, the hypervigilance spiking into full-blown panic. "You killed them," he gasped. "You killed my mom and dad, and then you made me. I saved your..." His voice broke. The rest of the sentence drowned in a sound that wasn't quite a scream and wasn't quite a sob. Julian did not move. He did not reach for the boy. He sat with his hands open on his knees, palms up, the most vulnerable posture a man like him could adopt, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Everything after that happened very fast. Victor's men found them at dawn. They'd tracked Julian through a network of hacked traffic cameras, triangulating his movement patterns over the past 36 hours. The raid came at 5:47 a.m., just as the first gray light began to seep through the coal plant's broken windows. The sound of boots on concrete, the crack of a flashbang, the harsh white beams of tactical flashlights slicing through the darkness. Julian fought. Even wounded from the previous night's ambush, a bullet grazed across his left shoulder that had reopened and bled through the makeshift bandage. He fought with the brutal efficiency of a man who had been killing since before Leo was born. Nico went down in the first exchange, taking 2 rounds to the chest as he covered Julian's retreat down a service corridor. Julian dragged Leo behind a row of rusted machinery, firing controlled bursts from a weapon he'd retrieved from one of his emergency caches. They made it out through a loading dock, stumbling into the pre-dawn gray, Julian's shoulders soaking his shirt with blood. They ran, the boy and the bleeding crime lord, through a maze of industrial wreckage until they found temporary shelter in an abandoned machine shop that smelled of motor oil and decay. In the silence that followed, Leo did what his instincts demanded. He searched for something to stop the bleeding. Julian's bag, a leather messenger bag he'd carried throughout their 48 hours together, had been dropped in the corner during their frantic entry. Leo unzipped it with shaking hands, looking for cloth, bandages, anything. His hands went still. Inside the bag, nestled among bundles of untraceable cash and 2 forged passports, lay a gold ring. Not the one Julian had shown him earlier. This was the master ring, the original, larger and more ornate, the symbol of the organization's leadership. The crow and coin, rendered in exquisite detail on a bed of solid gold. Leo lifted it from the bag and held it up. In the gray light filtering through the shop's broken skylights, the crow seemed to stare at him with its tiny cast eyes. He looked at Julian, who sat slumped against the far wall, one hand pressed against his bleeding shoulder. Their eyes met, and this time there was no confusion in the boy's gaze. No denial, only a cold, crystalline clarity that was worse than hatred. "You still carry it," Leo said. "Not a question. After everything you told me, after you knew what it did to my family, you still wear their blood on your hand." Julian opened his mouth, but Leo was already moving. The boy's hand found Julian's fallen pistol on the concrete floor. He picked it up. The weapon was absurdly large in his small hands, the muzzle wavering as he lifted it and pointed it at the man who had destroyed his world. Julian looked at the gun. Then he looked at the boy behind it. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not call for help. He simply sat there, bleeding, and waited. "Go ahead," Julian said quietly. "You've earned it." Leo's finger found the trigger. His hand shook violently. The barrel trembled. His face contorted with the effort of willing his finger to squeeze, to close the circuit, to deliver the justice that 2 years of grief and rage demanded. He couldn't do it. A sound tore from his throat, part scream, part animal cry, and he hurled the gun across the room, where it clattered against the far wall. Then he turned and ran, bursting through the machine shop door and into the frozen morning. Julian did not chase him. He heard the boy's footsteps receding, the desperate slap of laceless sneakers on icy pavement, growing fainter until they were swallowed by the city. He sat alone in the machine shop, bleeding, and understood with perfect clarity that the boy was running directly into Victor's kill zone. 20 minutes later, Julian's remaining encrypted phone buzzed. A single message from an unknown number. An image, Leo, bound and gagged, kneeling on a concrete floor. Behind him, 4 armed men. Behind them, the unmistakable rusted lattice of the Packard plant, Detroit's most famous ruin, a quarter-mile of crumbling concrete that had been rotting since 1958. A text followed the image. "Come alone. No weapons. Bring the account codes or the kid stops breathing. You have 1 hour." Julian read the message twice. Then he stood up, pressed a fresh wad of cloth against his shoulder, and walked out into the Detroit morning. The Packard plant sprawled across East Grand Boulevard like the skeleton of a dead leviathan, 6 stories of shattered concrete and rusted steel stretching for blocks. Graffiti covered every reachable surface. Pigeons nested in the upper floors. The city had been talking about demolishing it for decades, but like everything else in Detroit, the plan never quite materialized. It stood as it had always stood, a monument to collapse. Julian entered through the main loading dock on the south side, exactly as instructed. No weapon, no backup. Nico was dead or dying in the coal plant. The rest of Julian's loyalists were either turned, dead, or unreachable. He walked alone through corridors of debris, his footsteps echoing in the vast, hollow space, his shadow stretching long in the industrial light that filtered through gaps in the roof. He found them on the third floor, in a space that had once been an assembly line. Victor stood on an elevated concrete platform at the far end, flanked by 6 men, all armed. Below the platform, Leo knelt on the bare floor, his wrists zip-tied behind his back, a strip of duct tape across his mouth. The boy's eyes were red and swollen, but when they found Julian, they held no relief. Only a furious, anguished confusion that hurt worse than any bullet. "Jules," Victor called out, spreading his arms in mock welcome. "My brother. My blood. Look at what you've been reduced to. Running through sewers with a street rat." Julian stopped 20 feet from the platform and stood still. He was aware of every weapon in the room, every angle of fire, every potential point of cover. But he made no move toward any of them. "You look terrible, by the way," Victor continued, stepping down from the platform with theatrical ease. He was shorter than Julian, thicker, with the same dark eyes but none of the patience. "Shot, bleeding, crawling through tunnels. All for what, a kid? Since when does the architect have a heart?" "Since he needed one," Julian said. Victor's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second. The answer wasn't what he'd expected. He'd prepared for defiance, for threats, for the cold negotiating Julian he'd stood beside for 15 years. This quiet admission of vulnerability from a man who had never shown any was, for a brief moment, unsettling. Then Victor recovered, smoothing his expression back into contempt. "You know what's funny, Jules?" Victor said, circling slowly. His shoes crunched on broken glass. "I spent 2 years planning this. 2 years watching you, learning your patterns, turning your people. And the whole time, I thought the hardest part would be killing you. Turns out the hardest part was pretending to respect you." He stopped in front of Leo and looked down at the bound boy with theatrical pity. "And now you're going to trade a fortune for this? A stray dog you picked up 48 hours ago?" Julian said nothing. His eyes remained on Leo. Victor laughed, but the sound had an edge to it, the frustration of a man who wanted a reaction and wasn't getting one. "Fine, poetic. I'll put that on your headstone." He extended his hand. "The codes, all offshore accounts. The biometric key." Julian reached slowly into his pocket and produced a phone. Matte black, unmarked, the screen dark. He held it up so Victor could see it. "This unlocks everything," Julian said. "The accounts in Zurich, the trust in the Caymans, the holdings in Singapore, 40 years of work, all of it." "Then hand it over," Victor said, "and maybe I let the kid go. Maybe." Julian looked past Victor, down at Leo on the floor. The boy was watching him with those sharp, unbearable eyes. Even gagged, even bound, even trembling with cold and terror, those eyes missed nothing. Julian lowered himself to his knees. The movement rippled through the room. Victor's men exchanged glances. Leo made a muffled sound behind his gag. Julian Corsi, the architect, the man who had built and ruled an empire through intelligence, violence, and an iron refusal to show weakness, knelt on the concrete floor of a ruined factory and placed the phone on the ground in front of him. "Take it," Julian said. Victor grinned and stepped forward to retrieve the device. As he reached down, Julian raised his head and looked directly at Leo. The boy's eyes were streaming tears he couldn't wipe away, tears of rage and betrayal and something else, something that looked horribly, unmistakably like grief. Julian held the boy's gaze and spoke. Not to Victor, not to the gunman, to Leo. His voice was raw, stripped of every defense, every calculation, every mask he had ever worn. "I took your family from you. Tonight, I give you back your life. We're even." Victor snatched up the phone, triumph glittering in his eyes. He pressed Julian's thumb to the biometric reader. The screen flickered to life, displaying a cascade of account numbers and access codes worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He didn't notice that the phone's activation had also sent a signal. A signal to the building's ancient electrical grid, which Julian had spent 20 minutes rewiring before entering the plant. The industrial floodlights that Victor's men had rigged throughout the third floor were connected to the same system. Julian had wired them in series with a surge capacitor salvaged from the plant's old machinery. When the phone's signal reached the capacitor, it released its stored charge through every light simultaneously. The explosion of light was blinding. Every bulb in the assembly hall detonated at once, showering the room in a cascade of sparks and shattered glass. The space plunged into absolute darkness. Victor's men screamed. Someone fired blindly, the muzzle flash strobing the darkness in white bursts. Julian moved in the dark the way Leo moved through tunnels. By instinct, by memory, by the map he'd built in his mind during the walk-in. He reached the first gunman in 3 seconds, disarming him with a wrist lock that snapped bone. The second took a knife from Julian's sleeve to the thigh. The third went down to a chokehold. Julian fought like a wounded animal, graceless and brutal, using the darkness as his weapon and his knowledge of the space as his shield. Victor tried to run. Julian caught him at the stairwell. What followed was not elegant. It was 2 men who had shared blood and broken bread trying to kill each other with their bare hands in a pitch-dark ruin. Julian was older, wounded, and exhausted. Victor was younger, fresh, and desperate. But Julian had something Victor didn't. The absolute certainty that this was the last thing he would ever need to do. Julian killed his brother with his hands around his throat, and when it was over, he didn't feel anything at all. He found Leo in the dark by following the sound of muffled breathing. He cut the zip ties with Victor's knife and peeled the tape from the boy's mouth as gently as his blood-slicked hands could manage. Leo gasped, coughed, and said nothing. Julian tried to stand and couldn't. The gunshot wound in his shoulder had torn open completely during the fight, and he realized with clinical detachment that at least 2 more bullets had found him during the chaos. One in the side, one somewhere in his lower abdomen. His shirt was soaked through. The concrete beneath him was warm and wet. He lowered himself against the wall, his breathing shallow and rattling. In the distance, through the plant's broken walls, the first sirens began to wail. "Leo," Julian said. His voice was fading. "Inside pocket, left side." Leo's hands, still shaking, reached into Julian's coat and found a small object. A memory card, no larger than a thumbnail, sealed in a plastic case. "There's a trust," Julian said, each word costing more effort than the last. "Set up 3 years ago. Lawyer named Whitfield in Windsor. The card gets you in. New name, school, money, enough for a life, a real one." Leo held the card and looked at the man bleeding out on the floor. The man who had killed his parents. The man who had taught him to read hands instead of eyes. The man who had draped a cashmere coat over his shivering body. The man who had knelt on a concrete floor and traded his empire for a child's life. "Why?" Leo asked. It was the only word he could manage. Julian's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, something older and sadder than a smile. "Because 2 years ago, I burned down a building and told myself it was just business. Acceptable losses." His eyes found Leo's in the dim light. "There's no such thing as acceptable losses. I know that now. Took a kid to teach me." He lifted his hand slowly and pressed something into Leo's palm. The gold ring, the crow and coin, the symbol of everything Julian had built and everything it had cost. "Melt it down," Julian whispered. "Make it something else, something clean." His hand fell. His breathing slowed. His eyes, still open, still sharp, fixed on a point somewhere past Leo's shoulder, past the ruin, past Detroit, past everything. "Run," Julian said, "toward the light, and don't ever look back. Don't become what I was." Leo gripped the memory card in one hand and the ring in the other. Tears ran down his dirty face, silent and continuous. He didn't wipe them away. He knelt there, a child in a ruined factory, holding the last 2 possessions of a dying monster who had found, in his final hours, something that resembled a soul. Then he stood, he turned, and he ran. Behind him, Julian Corsi, the architect of Detroit's criminal empire, closed his eyes. The sirens grew louder. The first light of dawn crept through the broken ceiling of the Packard plant, painting the concrete gold. The last thing Julian heard was not the sirens or the wind. It was the sound of small footsteps running, growing fainter, moving fast, heading east, toward the river, toward the bridge, toward Canada, toward morning, running toward the light. 15 years later. The Ambassador Bridge stretched across the Detroit River like a steel hymn, its cables humming in the spring wind, its span connecting 2 countries the way a handshake connects 2 strangers. Below, the river moved south toward Lake Erie, carrying with it the industrial runoff and broken promises of a city that had been dying and resurrecting itself for 100 years. A man stood at the bridge's midpoint, leaning on the railing, Looking west toward Detroit, he was 26 years old, lean and sharp-featured, with dark eyes that still moved a fraction faster than most people's, still scanning, still cataloging, though the urgency behind the habit had softened over the years. He wore a charcoal suit that fit well but wasn't expensive, and his briefcase bore the modest logo of a legal aid nonprofit. His name, legally, was Leo Whitfield. He had taken the lawyer's surname when the new identity was finalized. It felt right. A borrowed name for a borrowed life. He was a public defender now, specializing in juvenile cases, representing children who had been failed by every system designed to protect them. His office occupied the second floor of a converted warehouse in Corktown, 3 blocks from the restaurant where a lifetime ago, a boy had lunged from behind a dumpster and changed the course of a crime lord's final night. He hadn't planned to come back to Detroit. The trust had paid for a degree in Toronto, then law school at Osgoode Hall. He could have stayed in Canada, could have built a comfortable practice far from the frozen streets that still appeared in his dreams. But something pulled him back. Not revenge, not nostalgia, something quieter and more stubborn than either. The foundation he'd established operated out of the same Corktown building, the Corsi Marcos Foundation for Displaced Youth. He'd debated the name for months. Using Julian's surname felt like honoring a monster. Leaving it off felt like lying about where the money came from. In the end, he decided that the truth, even an uncomfortable truth, was the only foundation worth building on. The organization provided legal representation, housing placement, and educational support for homeless children in the Detroit metropolitan area. It employed 11 people, all of whom had been required as a condition of hiring to complete a 40-hour training program in trauma-informed care. Leo had written the curriculum himself, drawing on a psychology he understood not from textbooks but from the inside. On his right hand, where a gold ring had once rested, he wore a simple silver band, smooth, unadorned, no symbol, no crow, no coin. The gold had been melted down at a jeweler shop in Windsor the week after Leo crossed the bridge for the first time. The jeweler, an elderly Vietnamese man who asked no questions, had poured the molten gold into a mold, and Leo had watched the crow dissolve into nothing, its beak, its coin, its meaning, all liquefied and reformed into a plain silver band using a technique the jeweler called kintsugi in reverse, not filling cracks with gold, but melting gold down to something without cracks at all. Leo touched the band now, a habit he'd developed the way some people touch a scar, not because it hurt, but because it reminded him that healing was a choice made daily, not a destination reached once. The sun was rising over Detroit. The light caught the new construction cranes downtown, the refurbished buildings along the riverfront, the slow, stubborn resurrection of a city that refused to be a ruin. Leo watched it the way he watched everything, carefully, completely, missing nothing. Then he picked up his briefcase, turned east, and walked back toward the Canadian side, where his first client of the morning, a 13-year-old girl who had been sleeping in a parking garage for 6 weeks, was waiting for someone to tell her that her life was not over. That it was, in fact, just beginning. Thank you for staying until the very end. If this story touched your heart, please hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our next story. New powerful stories every day. See you in the next one.